The desert sun had long begun to melt into gold and crimson when Ethan Cole spotted a small, trembling figure by the edge of the canyon. He was a cowboy hardened by solitude and the long, merciless wind of the frontier, yet something about the girl's fragile silhouette stopped him cold. She couldn't have been more than 12, barefoot, her dress torn, and her dark hair tangled with dust. The wind carried her quiet sobs across the empty plain. Ethan dismounted slowly, his boots crunching over the sand, and the girl flinched as if expecting pain. "Easy there, little one," he said softly, raising his hands. "Ain't gonna hurt ya." She stared up at him with eyes like amber fire, sharp, wild, and full of fear. Around her neck hung a simple beaded pendant, cracked and old, but its design was unmistakably Apache. Ethan's heart twisted. He knew what had happened here. Somewhere out in the hills, another raid had left its ghosts behind. He offered her a drink from his canteen. She hesitated, then snatched it with trembling hands, drinking greedily. "You got a name?" he asked. She muttered something too soft to hear, so he tried again, gentler. "You alone out here?" The girl nodded once, then clutched the pendant tight to her chest as if guarding a secret. He didn't ask more. The desert didn't forgive questions. When he lifted her onto his horse, she didn't resist. That night, under a sky bleeding with stars, he built a fire by a dry creek bed. The girl sat across from him, silent but watching every move. Her eyes followed his knife as he cut strips of jerky, as if waiting to see whether he'd turn that blade on her. Instead, he smiled faintly and tossed her the first piece. She ate without a word. In her silence, he recognized something, pain he'd seen before in orphaned calves, in soldiers left for dead. The kind of loneliness no man should ever feel, let alone a child. By morning, he'd made up his mind. "Guess you'll ride with me to Red Creek," he said, pretending not to notice the spark of panic in her eyes. "Ain't safe here." She said nothing, but when he climbed into the saddle, she grabbed his coat and refused to let go. For days they rode across barren land, sleeping under open skies and sharing what little food he had. Slowly, she began to trust him, tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick, pointing at birds, whispering words in Apache. Her name, he learned, was Taya. Sometimes she hummed an old tune that stirred something ancient in the air. Ethan couldn't explain it, but the sound made the world seem softer. He found himself looking at her and wondering who she belonged to, what mother's heart was breaking out there in the desert. Image prompt for Part 1. A cowboy on horseback in a glowing sunset finds a lost Apache girl standing near a canyon, dust swirling, sky painted red and gold, her hair tangled by the wind and her eyes full of mystery. Part 2. Weeks passed, and Taya began to smile again. Ethan taught her to feed the horses, to ride with the wind in her hair, and even to laugh at the coyotes that sang at night. He took her into town for supplies, though the stares they drew were harsh, men whispering about Injun blood, and crazy Cole picking up strays. Ethan didn't care. He'd lost too much to judgment already. The war had taken his brother, the land had taken his peace, but this child had given him something back, purpose. "You stick with me, girl," he said one night by the fire. "Ain't no one gonna hurt you again." Taya didn't answer in words, but she leaned against his arm, and that was enough. Then, one afternoon, while they were out fixing the fence near the old oak, a shadow fell across the horizon. A rider. No. 3. Ethan's hand went instinctively to his revolver. The lead rider dismounted slowly, and the sun caught her face, bronze skin, high cheekbones, and eyes that blazed with pride. She was no mere traveler. Her presence carried weight, dignity, sorrow. The girl froze, the color draining from her face. "Nash," she whispered in Apache, her voice trembling. "Mother." Ethan's breath caught as the woman walked closer, her hair braided with silver threads, her movements graceful but commanding. "I am Nyan," she said, her voice rich and steady. "You found my daughter." For a moment, the desert itself seemed to pause. Ethan looked between them, disbelief heavy in his chest. "Your daughter." The woman nodded slowly, her gaze softening as Taya rushed forward, tears streaking her dusted cheeks. The reunion was wordless and pure, mother and child clinging together beneath the blazing sky. Ethan stood aside, his throat tight. Then Nyan turned her eyes to him, dark, fierce, and full of gratitude. "You saved her," she said simply. "You saved what was left of my world." He opened his mouth to reply, but words failed. The warmth in her gaze held him still, more powerful than any gun he'd ever drawn. That night, Nyan stayed at the ranch. The firelight danced on her face as she spoke softly in both English and Apache, telling stories of her people, of raids, loss, and the strength that kept her alive. Ethan listened, every word drawing him closer. She was not just beautiful, she was formidable, carved from the same wild earth as the desert itself. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, the curve of her smile, the sorrow hidden behind it. Something stirred in him that he hadn't felt in years. And when she met his gaze across the fire, something unspoken passed between them, a promise, or perhaps a warning. Image prompt for Part 2. A rugged cowboy stands beside his horse as an elegant Apache widow dismounts in the sunset. Her daughter runs into her arms, while the golden desert wind swirls around them, heavy with emotion and reunion. Part 3. The days that followed were filled with quiet transformation. Nyan and Taya stayed at the ranch, helping him repair fences, tend to the animals, and cook meals that filled the house with spices he'd never known. Their laughter echoed through the canyon like music. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the loneliness of his land lift. Yet behind every smile, he saw the shadow in Nyan's eyes, the weight of old grief. One evening, when the wind blew soft through the open door, she told him the truth. Her husband had been killed 2 winters ago by bounty hunters who mistook him for a raider. She had hidden Taya, but the girl had fled, lost in a storm. When I thought she was gone, she whispered, staring into the fire, I stopped breathing, though my heart kept beating. Ethan said nothing, only reached out and took her hand. She didn't pull away. Over time, what began as gratitude deepened into something unspoken. He'd find her standing by the corral at dawn, her hair catching the first light, her eyes softening when she saw him. He taught her to ride, she taught him her language, how to call the wind Nilche, how to say, heart, Azayu. They began to move around each other with a quiet rhythm, as if the desert itself had written their story long ago. One night, while Taya slept, Nyan turned to him beneath the stars. You've given her a home, she said softly. You've given me one too. He wanted to answer, but before he could, she leaned in, her forehead touching his. In that moment, the silence between them spoke louder than words. Months later, travelers passing through Red Creek would whisper about the cowboy and the Apache widow who worked their ranch side by side. Some called it scandal, others called it love. But for Ethan, it was neither. It was redemption, his soul, finally finding rest in the arms of a woman who carried both strength and sorrow like sacred fire. And for Nyan, it was the end of wandering, the beginning of something she thought her people had lost forever, peace. On quiet nights, they would sit together watching the stars while Taya's laughter filled the air. I found her by accident, Ethan would say softly, his arm around Nyan's shoulders. No, she would whisper back with a smile that melted the dark, the desert gave her to you, so we could find each other. The weeks that followed felt like a strange dream for Ethan Cole, half peace, half tension. Taya had started to laugh again, her small hands busy brushing the horses or gathering wildflowers near the creek. Ethan would catch her humming that same haunting melody, the one that stirred the dust and carried something of the past with it. He tried not to think too hard about where she came from, but some nights, when the coyotes howled, she would wake screaming in Apache words he couldn't understand. Each time, he sat beside her, murmuring softly until she calmed. Somewhere deep inside, he'd already begun to think of her as his own. But fate, as it often did on the frontier, had other plans. It was a late afternoon when he saw the riders. 3 dark figures rising over the ridge, their horses kicking up long clouds of dust. Instinct made Ethan reach for his rifle. Strangers rarely came this far off the trail unless they were looking for trouble, or someone. The lead rider dismounted with deliberate grace, the kind of movement that spoke of strength and command. Ethan froze as the figure stepped into the light. She was tall, her skin the warm bronze of desert dusk, her hair braided with silver threads that shimmered under the sun. The moment her eyes met his, the air between them seemed to thicken. Behind her, the other 2 riders held their horses, watching silently. The girl, Taya, had been tending a fire near the corral. When she looked up, her eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. Then came a sound Ethan had never heard from her before, a cry that was half sob, half prayer. She ran toward the woman, tears streaking down her dusted cheeks, and threw herself into her arms. Nash, she cried in Apache, her voice trembling. The woman dropped to her knees, clutching the child close, murmuring something in a tongue Ethan couldn't follow. But the meaning was clear. This wasn't a rescue, this was a homecoming. For a long while, Ethan stood still, his hand lowering from his gun. The desert wind blew hot and dry between them, but the world seemed silent, watching. Finally, the woman rose, still holding Taya's small hand. Her gaze found his again, steady and unflinching. "You found her," she said in English, her voice low, melodic, but edged with sorrow. "She is mine." Ethan could only nod. "Name's Ethan Cole," he said quietly. "Found her near the canyon 3 weeks back. Thought she was all alone." The woman inclined her head. "I am Nyan, her mother." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap that never broke. He felt a strange tightness in his chest, relief, confusion, something else he didn't yet dare name. Taya pressed against her mother's skirt, still glancing back at him, as if afraid he might disappear. Nyan's eyes softened when she saw it. "You cared for her," she said simply. "You saved my child." Ethan shifted uneasily. "Did what any man ought to," he muttered. "Desert's no place for a girl alone." That night, he invited them to stay at the ranch. The stars were burning bright as the three of them sat by the fire. Nyan's presence seemed to bend the air itself. There was a quiet strength about her, the kind that came from surviving pain that would have broken most. She spoke sparingly, her English careful, shaped by years of silence and loss. When she smiled, though, it was like light breaking through storm clouds. She told him of her people, of raids and betrayals, of a husband taken from her 2 winters ago. She had searched every canyon, every trail, until she found a scrap of her daughter's dress caught on a cactus thorn. Then she had followed the tracks, never resting. "I thought I had lost her forever," she whispered. "And now, she is here." Ethan stared into the fire, words caught in his throat. He wanted to say something, anything, but what could he offer to a woman who had walked through hell to find what was hers? Yet when he finally met her gaze, he saw something unexpected. Gratitude, yes, but also recognition. As if she could see the same emptiness in him that had been in her for so long. "You live alone?" she asked. He nodded. "Since my brother passed, just me and the land now." She studied him a long while, then said quietly, "Maybe that is why the desert let you find her. It gives what is lost to those who are empty enough to keep it." Her words struck something deep in him. He looked away, pretending to check the horses, but his heart was racing. Nyan was unlike anyone he'd met, proud, graceful, yet marked by tragedy. The firelight painted her features in gold, her eyes gleaming like the stars above them. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt the stirrings of something he thought he'd buried, hope. When Taya finally fell asleep, Nyan lingered by the dying embers. She reached into her pouch and took out the small, cracked pendant Ethan had seen around the girl's neck. "This," she said softly, "belonged to my mother. She gave it to me when I was Taya's age. I gave it to her the night the men came. You kept it safe." Her hand brushed his as she passed it back, and the touch sent a strange warmth through him. She looked into his eyes then, and for a moment, the fire reflected in both of them as one flame. "Thank you, Ethan Cole," she said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. "You gave me back my heart." He wanted to tell her she owed him nothing, that he was only doing what was right. But the words never came. Instead, they sat there in silence, the desert wind whispering through the grass, the stars burning brighter overhead. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried into the night, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't feel so alone.